Hello everyone, I'm going to walk you through basic visual analysis, and I thought today I'd choose a piece that may be a little bit different than what you might have seen in the BMA, or sort of maybe a little more challenging in the sense that it's not a traditional landscape or a portrait. Um, and so this piece is called Reservoir. It was made by Robert Rauschenberg. It's made of mixed media, and it was created in 1961. To start with this piece, the focal point, when I'm searching around, my eye really searches at the clocks first, and that may be because we're so trained to look at things like numbers and text. Also, they're very high contrast, and the scale is pretty large. So the one that really attracts my attention is the one that is on the upper left side here. Um, it also connects to that piece of wood that or metal that is attached to the canvas above. From the focal point, my eye travels across that horizontal beam to the other side of the canvas, and then really starts to play a game of connecting the round shapes that we've sort of studied, right? Which is a way of establishing rhythm. So there's round shapes that are geometric, and but they change, so that creates a sense of rhythm, a sense of speed. um, and so as you travel across this piece, you really start to see that my eyes at least go in this sort of triangular pattern across this beam and down to the one on the bottom and then back up here. So what we have here is a triangle shape, but it's not a traditional golden triangle, and that's okay. One of the interesting things that Rauschenberg is doing here is he's playing with symmetry and balance, right? He's sort of adding things across bits of paint that are the same on either side, so that establishes a sense of symmetry, but then he completely throws it off with this clock on the bottom left. Um, the way that this piece was made is actually an interesting anecdote. Rauschenberg would go out to the alley behind his studio in Manhattan in the early 60s. New York was a very different place back then. And he would just find whatever detritus was laying around and incorporate it into his paintings. And what that would do is create this sort of spur of the moment um, kind of improvisation, almost like a jazz piece, where he's taking the found objects and responding in paint. What that does is sets up a really interesting texture, right? Because you have things that almost look like trash, like these bags. You have bits of metal, and then you have like the sort of like consumer object of the clock, all kind of smashing together on the same piece, right? So here, what we would call this is actual texture, because it's not necessarily creating an illusion of texture the way that, say, Van Gogh would. This is actually, if you were to put your hand on this, you would feel texture, right? Um, Color-wise, we have an interesting color scheme going on here because Rauschenberg is using quite a bit of white in his image. Um, but then you have the kind of key of this orange splotch down here and the blue here, which are complements, right? Off of this orange, you can connect to the red, which is analogous, right? It's sort of right next to the orange on the color wheel. And then you could kind of make the argument that either this is sort of a different value and that it's mixed with black, or perhaps the pigment shifts. It's hard to tell exactly through this digital reproduction, but the blue is definitely a neighbor to this blue here. So if you can imagine that on the color wheel, you would have a compound, which is the K shape. You have the complements straight across, and then each of those complements has a pair. So that establishes always sort of an interesting color scheme. We've talked about balance. We would talk about scale in this piece. It's a pretty large piece. It's approximately 4 feet tall. So here you have, that's the actual dimension of the artwork, which we call size. Scale is the relationship to the human body. So these clocks are, a one-to-one scale with what an actual clock is, obviously, because they are found clocks. So that creates a really interesting relationship with humans as you look at this piece. It's almost life size, and it really is kind of imposing as it comes to meet you. Some of the Gestalt principles that Rauschenberg plays with here are symmetry, obviously, that we've talked about before. Proximity is an interesting one in that as things are grouped in this canvas, we start to read them as the same things. Um, Not a lot of like sort of closure and figure ground. I would say more of a continuation as you hop, almost like to lily pads in a stream to get from object to object. Okay, so in your visual analysis here, you would list all of these things, but you'd pick your top three. So what I'm thinking, some of the top three that are really sort of having a heavy impact here, right? Um, One would be, I would say the color scheme is certainly having an effect on the mood that is established in the piece. Another would be texture of the found objects. And I think the third would probably, I would pick the composition, which is an atypical. It's a triangle, but it's an atypical triangle composition. So we've covered denotative, right? We've basically described this piece to someone who might not be seeing it. Now we're going to move on to connotative. So what does this piece make you feel? And through those lenses of composition, texture, and color, how does this piece communicate? How does it make you feel? What does it make you think of? So connotatively, I think the clocks, which actually I should mention are moving in real time as you look at this. There's still a battery in the clocks. So that makes you aware of the time that you're spending with the artwork, which is really kind of interesting. The clocks are primarily lining up on the left side of the canvas. And as we mentioned, those become major players in the triangular composition. And so what that's doing is really throwing off the balance a bit on the overall composition, heavily weighting it on the left side. And that will have some effects on the way that we interpret the entire piece because it feels a bit out of balance. The color has an interesting connotation in that it feels a bit like something out of nature, even though a lot of the objects he's using in the piece are not so natural. But it has a little bit of a feel of like perhaps a sun up here, or there's a little bit of a water effect happening here. So there's this element of calm that comes in the compound color scheme that is also a little exciting in that it kind of jumps across the color scheme, but it puts you in a nice mood. There's this really kind of interesting, and I know I'm saying interesting many times because I'm doing this off the cuff. You want to avoid repeating words like that, but that's definitely a crutch that I use often. Here you have this kind of in-between peachy color that is a little bit soothing. And then to contrast that, the texture really comes in, and you feel like maybe there's a story behind these objects. They feel like things that might have been thrown out, that or someone had been evicted, or it also brings into question what we value, which is a good segue into the ideological. Here we have this idea of time passing. Often things that we buy do have a mortality to them. They're in fashion one moment, they're out of fashion the next. Taking things that you find on the ground that are being thrown out and putting them on a canvas, taking them off the horizontal plane, putting them on the vertical plane, raising them, putting them on the white walls of the gallery is certainly an interesting way of questioning what we value in our society. There's quotes like, time is money, that may come into play here. Along that same path, I think this piece really questions mortality because you have a ticking clock, you have things that are being thrown out, maybe things that are being regenerated, and the feel of the colors that I was talking about has sort of a natural feel. So you have this sort of idea of industrial things and also nature, and they both have a certain element of time embedded in them. So the last thing I might mention here is that this piece would be totally different if it was on a horizontal format, right? Format is the way that it's positioned on the wall. The fact that it's vertical makes me think that there's a human being somewhere as almost a ghost behind this piece. And that becomes very interesting. and that it almost feels like a portrait of someone's life, or someone that is maybe, has one clock for their job and another clock for their recreation, which is another way that society kind of affects us. So, all in all, this is a piece that comes at you from a variety of fronts. The strongest being the texture that really sort of overwhelms you and jumps out at you, the prefabricated elements, the color, which contrasts that with sort of a calm approach, softening, creating a sense of shallow depth. And the colors that are used, as we saw before, allude to something that is time-based, like a sunset. And then on top, we have the composition, which is throwing us off balance, not allowing us to feel comfortable, keeping us on edge at all times. And this off balance, sort of not harmonious feeling from the composition is really what adds a layer to the meaning, sort of away from the calm of the color scheme and into something a little more foreboding, perhaps about mortality or death. Those three elements come together to create a piece that asks many questions and keeps us looking for a longer time while we can actually observe the time that is passing while we look.